I wanted to welcome everyone again to the August Healthy Aging Speaker Series hosted by the Columbine Health System Center for Healthy Aging at CSU. This month we'll be featuring Dr. Dr. Aga Burzynska and her talk, Lifestyle Modifiers of Brain Aging. Aga is an assistant professor in CSU's Department of Human Development and Family Studies and Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Neurosciences, affiliate faculty at the Translational Medicine Institute at CSU, and director of the Brain Lab. She's the recipient of the Innovative Research on Aging Award from Mather Lifeways Institute on Aging and the Max Planck Society Otto Hahn Medal for Outstanding Academic Achievements. Her research focuses on understanding the relationship between modifiable lifestyle factors such as activity level, exercise, and occupational exposure, and brain and cognitive function. And she has been doing neuroimaging for over 10 years. Thank you so much, Aga. We look forward to it.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Welcome, everyone. I see a lot of faces, and also it's really great to see some of my students from my classes and my lab here. So welcome, everyone. And I'll be now sharing my screen. I'm not sure if you see me anymore. I'm not sure. Not so used to Zoom. Okay, I'll be now trying to share the presentation. Okay, so welcome again, and thank you, Ali, for this great introduction. I try to keep my talk short, so I will ask for your attention only for about 22 minutes. And I hope that my talk today will answer some of your questions you might have about aging brains. And we know that, aging is inevitable, so it relates to all of us. It doesn't matter if we're in our 60s or 20s, we are kind of all headed in the same direction. And as Ali said, my home department is Human Development and Family Studies, but this type of research really requires interdisciplinary setting. That's why you can see here the different centers that and programs I'm affiliated with. And actually the scanner machine at CSU, which is pretty new, is located at the Translational Medicine Institute. Okay, so we see that our population is aging. On the right side, you can see the population pyramid from 1960, when there were definitely the most people were the kids and young adults. And then as we go up in that pyramid, the older people get, the less people were counted. And you can see a dramatic difference to the prediction for 2060. When the number of people that are children, young kids, teenagers, and young adults remains similar. However, there's this big increase in number in middle-aged adults, older adults, as well as the very old adults. So our dynamics or the population structure is changing. And it is great in a way because this means that we live longer and healthier. However, our bodies age anyways, even if we grow older. And older age predisposes us for chronic diseases. And those diseases eventually may lead to loss of independence, as well as decreased quality of life for people. And this also means that there's a lot of, burden on the older people themselves, as well as their caregivers and the society, right? So we try to keep everyone healthy as long as possible. And it may be surprising, but the cognitive decline is the main reason for loss of independence in older age. I must say that even I was thinking like, well, it should be perhaps mobility, maybe like arthritis that may prevent people from doing everyday tasks, but it's actually cognitive decline because it's the management of everyday tasks, memorizing what has to be done, taking care of oneself when it comes to cooking, shopping, toileting, taking medications. All of this can become really overwhelming. And that's why what I not only know from research, but I also hear from caregivers is that the cognitive decline often is the main reason when people or their families start seeking for, at-home caregiver, adult cares, like daycare situation, or even some permanent living situations like out of home. And I think a lot of us, when we think of cognitive decline that may prevent us from independent living, we think about dementia. However, the number or the percentage of people who will be diagnosed with dementia is large, but it's, on the other hand, not that big. So for all adults older than 65, about 1 in 10 people in their lifetime will be diagnosed with dementia. And this number triples for people older than 85. But it is important to notice that before people are, like this smaller percentage of people are diagnosed with dementia, it is preceded by a long preclinical stage when there are no symptoms or they totally don't interfere with everyday life. And then it progresses into mild cognitive impairment when people are still having, good amount of cognitive performance, and only then, and some of them, it progresses onto dementia. So what I wanted to show you here is that when you look at this red line, which is representing healthy cognitive aging, so the percentage of the lucky ones, the 90% of people above 65, you can still see a marked decrease in cognitive function. So what I will be talking about today, and what we are interested in our research, is actually not pathological cognitive aging such as dementia, but actually healthy aging that can be pronounced enough to cause some decrease in the quality of life and everyday independence. So even those, lucky ones that will not experience cognitive impairment at any level, we know that there is still a marked decrease in speed, memory, and executive function. Let's say from the age of 25, which you see on the left side of this graph, to the age of 80. And that's why in my lab, we are really interested in neuronal mechanisms and also lifestyle modifiers of this cognitive change. And we know that those cognitive functions, they are performed by our brain. And this is why we study the brain as the kind of, biological organ responsible for aging of our cognitive functions. So on the right side, you can see MRI image. So the movie takes you from one ear to another. It is a typical standard structural MRI image of the human brain. And there are, in our lab, we are trying to understand what's going on in the brain of people who age cognitively and neuronally in a healthy way. And we are in particularly interested in how physical activity or lack of physical activity relates to brain aging. Because we know, for example, from the recommendations of American Heart Association, that there is some minimum level of physical activity that is supposed to reduce mortality and cardiovascular risk. But it is still not fully understood, how physical activity actually can improve our brain health. And there are many things we can study inside the brain. We can study the volume, the brain activity. But what I'm particularly interested in is the white matter. So when first anatomists opened the human skull centuries ago, when it was, believed of an illegal or in some ways, it was not allowed for many years to investigate human body. So when those first daring anatomists opened the skull, they noticed that inside of the brain, there's this white amorphic substance surrounded by the gray layer that they call the cortex. And for a long, long time, white matter was just considered white matter. There was some histological research on it, but it never really gained so much interest. And now the modern neuroimaging techniques allow us to see the full beauty and complexity of the white matter. So you can see on the right side, this image comes from diffusion tensor imaging. It's a magnetic resonance imaging technique that's completely non-invasive. And based on the diffusion of water molecules, we can reconstruct those fibers that basically interconnect every cell in our brain. So of course, this is slightly simplified compared to what we have in our brain because those connections are much smaller, but I still think it's pretty impressive how beautiful it looks, and it helps you appreciate the complexity, the structural scaffolding or skeleton of our brain function. And this is why also I'm, really passionate about studying the white matter. And another interesting thing about white matter in the brain is that for decades, it has been considered static, and that once it develops and reaches maturity in early or middle adulthood, then it can only undergo degeneration. So here on the left side, you can see this intact fiber with myelin sheets around us. So those myelin sheets are the lipid layers that allow electrical signals to travel faster in our brain. And on the right side, you just see it's more artistic visualization of the age-related damage that can happen to both those axons and myelin. So we know that this is what happens in the brain. However, we know it mostly from animal studies or human post-mortem studies. And so for decades, white matter was considered static. We all know about multiple sclerosis or injuries to the spinal cord that we know that are very, very hard to heal. However, recent animal models showed that white matter has actually a surprisingly large amount of plasticity. So on this top picture, you see that myelin can become thinner or thicker. And lower, you can see that even the diameter of those axons or fibers can change. And both of those processes, they affect the speed of electrical signals in our brain. So we know that based on experience, it's not only, our neurotransmitters and maybe volume of our brains that may change, but now we know that it's very likely that white matter is also plastic. So let me introduce you, before I go into some of the results from my lab, I would like to introduce you to my small group, which is very diverse with respect to the expertise. So in the middle, you see Andrea, and she already holds an MD degree and is now pursuing her graduate studies in the psychology and the neuroscience program. And Michelle is a very talented and ambitious undergraduate student who pursues double engineering degree. So this is our team and the scanner. And now I would like to perhaps answer a couple of common questions that may be of interest to anyone because we all age slightly every day. So how fast is our brain aging? So in the last 3 years, we conducted two analyses of the data where we measured healthy older adults that were 60 to 80 years old, 6 months apart. So we could test whether, in such a short time, like 6 months, do we see any just natural change in the white matter? And on the left side, you can see the result from this more standard technique, diffusion tensor imaging. And in all regions that you can see marked in yellow, orange, or red, this means that we observed some significant decline in the white matter health. So I think it's quite impressive that we can observe such change in just 6 months. And recently, Andrea, she's actually just preparing this publication. We calculated another type of signal we can recover from MRI images, and we actually observed the same. So on the right side, you can see two regions and the significant decline in the white matter health over just 6 months. So How fast is brain aging? Well, it seems like that we can even detect within person natural changes in periods as short as 6 months in old adults. Now, whose white matter ages the fastest? Because as you can imagine, in this group of about 170 people I just showed you, some people were aging faster and some were aging slower. So what we found that the older our participants were, the steeper was the 6 months decline in white matter health. But we also measured their physical activity as they entered the study. So they wore those hip accelerometers that can help us quantify the time they spent each day either sitting in light physical activity or in more aerobic exercise, high intensity physical activity. And we found that in some brain regions, those adults that spent more time sitting or were like they were aging faster, and those that were engaging in less aerobic exercise, their white matter was also aging faster. And I think that's really important observation, because this means that when we could when we assess the physical activity when they enter the study, it allows us to some extent predict who will be, declining the fastest over the next 6 months. We also did some correlational analysis where we did not really observe change, but we assessed the white matter health at a single time point. Again, in healthy older adults. And we observed, for example, that those that spent more time in light physical activity and less time sitting, they had greater white matter health. And also those that engaged in more aerobic exercise, they showed less of those white matter hyperintensities you can see here on the right. These are those white spots you can see in the middle of the brain. And the older we get, the more likely we are to show them in our brain. And they are related typically to some vascular changes in the brain. So it seems like that those who spend more time in modus high level intensity that really elevates your heart rate and metabolic rate, those people showed less of those age-related changes in the brain. So I just showed a result showing that, more sitting was related to faster rate of decline over 6 months or poorer brain health. So it is interesting to ask, is sitting always bad? And we answered this question using, again, physical activity assessments and cognitive functions. So there's no brain data in this picture. So if you look at the left side, you can see that the aerobic, as we would expect, the aerobic exercise was positively related with perceptual speed and reasoning. So those older adults who spent more time per day in this higher level of intensity of exercise, they were like faster in information processing and had better reasoning skills. However, on the right side of the figure, you see two correlations where actually we showed also that those who spent more time sitting had better vocabulary knowledge and better reasoning skills. So I find this finding is very interesting because we spend so much time sitting, and it's not only that when we grow older, we spend more and more time sitting, but now because of technology, even younger adults, we spend a lot of time sitting. And, there are a lot of interventions trying to increase physical activity, but especially in older age, a lot of older people may not be willing or may not be able to exercise or meet the guidelines. Another thing is we cannot really exercise the whole day. Nobody can. So what we do in this sedentary time seems also to matter. Although we did not measure exactly what those adults were doing in the sedentary time. But I think it's important to see that that sometimes the sedentary time can correlate with better performance on a specific cognitive functions. And as we know that at any given time, our total cognitive performance is a sum of all of those different functions, such as knowledge, reasoning, so like IQ, speed, and memory. And we also all differ in this. So I think in whatever way we can support our cognition should be good for our total cognitive performance. So is sitting always bad? It doesn't seem so, but it may matter what we do as we sit. Okay, so I showed you already that the white matter declines over 6 months, that older age and lower level of physical activity may be associated with poorer brain health. But now the question is, if we make people exercise, will the white matter health improve? And this can be only shown in an interventional or randomized clinical trials where we actually randomly assign a group of people into different conditions and have a control group to compare those interventions against. So in this study, we had people 60 to 80 years old. They were low active but healthy, so they could exercise and they didn't have cognitive decline. And for 6 months, all of them participated in 4 different types of activity. So here on the top right, you can see the control group, which was just doing stretching and toning, but received the same amount of social interactions, because we know that this can also boost our mood, cognitive performance, and maybe even brain health. Then one group was dancing, which was a combination of physical activity and cognitive stimulation. And 2 groups were walking. This was aerobic walking, designed to increase a metabolic rate and heart rate and breathing. And one group also did took some nutritional supplement that was supposed to improve even this effect of walking. And then we measured the white matter before and after the intervention. So again, a very short summary of the results. On the left side, you can see the main result from our study published 3 years ago when we used the standard diffusion tensor imaging. So we found that only the dance intervention kind of counteracted the decline in white matter integrity in the fornix. So this green region you can see here is the fornix. And this is a very important brain structure that is related to performance on the different cognitive functions, including memory and speed. And its degeneration is known to predict the transition from mild cognitive impairment to dementia. So our results indicate that some types of physical activity combined with cognitive stimulation, they can possibly counteract this decline that we see. So in those blue and black bars here, you can see a decrease over 6 months, and the red bar, which is the dense group, they increase their white matter health. Of course, such results always have to be replicated in different samples and so on. And on the right side, you can see reanalysis of the same data set using this new index of white matter health. And here you can see that the SSS group, which is the control group, declined over 6 months or was pretty stable. And especially walking and dancing group, the white matter health increased. So altogether, we have some evidence, initial evidence, that shows that 6 months of physical activity can indeed cause some positive changes in the white matter in older, healthy adults. So it is promising. And now the last kind of new direction of my research is about what we do at work. Because until now, I was telling you about leisure activities, right? So what we do when we go for dancing classes, engage in bike rides, and so on. However, the effect, the influence of our occupational exposures on brain aging has been really overlooked in the research for a long time. Because average American worker spends over 8 hours at work per day, and we tend to, on average, remain in the workforce for over 40 years. So weekly and like lifelong exposure is huge. And that's why I think it's quite surprising that so few studies looked into how this occupational exposure actually influences our brain. Can our occupations, be protective, or can they accelerate brain aging? So 2 years ago, we proposed this BOSS model, which stands for brain aging and occupational stimulation and stress, where we assumed that the occupational stress and stimulation may have parallel and maybe even interacting effects on the brain aging. So you can see that there has been quite some research in the last decades, actually, linking greater intellectual stimulation at work with better cognitive outcomes in older age. However, the effects of this intellectual stimulation on the brain, on the aging brain, has been studied only by, maybe 2-3 studies altogether. And there are many other aspects of our occupational exposures that you can see here on the left in red that have not been studied at all in the context of brain aging, such as the effects of psychological stress and burnout on subsequent brain aging, environmental hazards, or physical stress or physical activity at work, like physical demands. So what we did that in our participants from whom we had MRI data, we conducted a survey asking them about different aspects of their work in the past. So the work was supposed to be their kind of most recent or past work that lasted more than 2 years. And more than half of our participants were actually already retired. Some of them also reported some brief jobs and so on. And to cut the long story short, we found that among all of those occupational exposures, it was only the physical stress or physical demands at work that correlated with poor memory and smaller hippocampi in our older participants. And this is a very interesting finding because the hippocampus in our brain, which is this brain structure located inside our head, like behind the ears, it is critical for memory formation and other cognitive functions. And we also know it is very affected by normal aging, but also it shrinks a lot in dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So it is in our best interest to keep our hippocampus as healthy as possible. So the physical stress that our participants reported was actually like the perceived physical demands. And here it's something I would like to clarify because the media that covered our article made a bit of a shortcut there, because with the pictures that were associated with the story kind of came out that more physical jobs, so physical laborers, they have poor memory and smaller hippocampal, but that's actually not what we found in our study. So our study was actually the great majority of our participants were professional or semi-professional workers. So the physical stress we measured, it was not the title of the work, which we actually corrected for, but it was this physical demands that they perceived that their job is associated with, such as, the muscular endurance and reaching and grabbing that they perceived as stressful. So we do not exactly know how to explain it yet, but I think this finding opens the whole door to more and more research that will tell us more about how to measure those occupational exposures that matter most for our brain aging. And then, is there anything we can do in our workplace, maybe as early as in our 20s, 30s, 40s, to make sure that our brain is aging in this most optimal trajectory? And also, it's interesting because it seems that there may be like a different interplay between the leisure and occupational experiences. So now I just would like to summarize our research. And so we have shown that even healthy brains age. So this is a no surprise, but we have shown that our white matter ages over periods as short as 6 months, even in perfectly healthy, independently living older adults. And it's also a bit trivial, but we show that what we do every day perhaps matters. So the physical activity we do or we don't may matter for our brain aging. And we also have seen interesting dissociation between leisure and occupational physical activity or physical demands. And in experimental study, we have seen that the leisure aerobic training or dance causes those beneficial changes in white matter. However, when it comes to occupational physical stress, the correlations are the opposite. And I didn't mention, but actually in this occupational study, we did ask them about the leisure physical activity, and it was still related to greater hippocampal volume. So they seem to be the leisure and occupational physical activity or demands, they may be actually like overlapping and simultaneous. So I guess a lot of you think, so what would be the recommendation now? And I have to say that, you know, to really make a formal recommendation, those studies have to be replicated in different, you know, locations, different populations, with more diverse with respect to age and many other factors, populations, samples. But I would say that maybe the safest would be to try to meet those recommendations of weekly aerobic activity, which currently is at least 115 minutes per week of aerobic exercise. But at the same time, try to use our sedentary time for stimulating activities. So at least part of it, I know all of us sometimes need to like switch off and relax, but it may be important in also how we engage when we are sitting. So at least from time to time, taking an ambitious book and learning something new. This seems to be perhaps at the moment the safest recommendation I could give you. So thank you so much for your attention, and I hope that some of those points will be, you know, useful for you.
Thank you so much, Aga. I have a few questions from the chat. So do you have any updated information on the impact of of COVID-19 infection on long-term brain health?
That's a great question, and I do not have any good answers yet. We are actually thinking of, you know, maybe trying to do such research, whether, you know, I was thinking whether the past infection of COVID with a serious kind of outcome, whether it will not become some kind of variable we have to consider in our research. Like we know now that traumatic brain injury may change the course of aging. And I think it'll be super interesting to see whether COVID has any long-term effect. I think it's much too early to say, but if I will have this opportunity to gain access to clinical samples, and as you know, our research is still on hold because we are dealing with vulnerable population. I would be super excited to study this, but at the moment, I don't really know. I don't think we know yet. I think it differs also about how severe the infection was for the person.
And do you think the isolation being imposed on older adults could result in cognitive decline that is being, and resultant cognitive decline that's been observed by caregivers could be measured and monitored using some of the techniques you've described?
This is a good question. I know, I mean, there is definitely an intersection between mental states and cognitive ability. So we know that depression can also result in almost like cognitive impairments symptoms, although they are just caused by mental health, not so much about the cognitive health. I mean, we could definitely try to observe whether, let's say, the brain decline is faster in those who experience this isolation. But But as far as I know, I'm not yet aware of any of those studies. But yeah, I presume it may have effects on the brain. Yeah, there's no evidence yet, but I believe us as social, creatures, that this deprivation of certain complexity and human interaction will have some impact, perhaps.
Have you been able to gather information about whether one intense period of exercise per day prior to sitting all day at a desk is superior or inferior to an active job that requires walking and standing?
This is a very good question, and we call it an active or fit couch potato. And I think this is a very common pattern of physical activity now among everyone. Some, or actually maybe even most of people, they wake up in the morning, they go for half an hour to 1 hour workout in the gym, and then they go and sit the whole day at work. And I do not have yet a good answer, but this is definitely a pattern that we are investigating. It's not that easy to investigate because we have to define a couple of those things. But it seems like, from what I know, is that this 1 hour of exercise will help, and you can actually have high aerobic fitness just doing this, but it may not fully remove the possible negative metabolic effects of excessive sitting. Again, we don't have to feel guilty for all sitting we do, because it's a normal pattern. We cannot be exercising all the time. But I think what we know, especially from metabolic and cardiovascular research, and we know they are very tightly connected to the brain, is that the very prolonged amounts, lengths of sitting are not good, that it's good to break it up, even with just walking around home. It doesn't have to be high exercise. But, there's this interesting research, putting healthy people on bed rest, like forced bed rest. And some of the metabolic brain measures go like completely off charts. So we know that for multiple reasons, we should try, even if we work at a computer, just break it up. And I don't say, like, most of the sitting is okay, I think, but if we tend to sit this like 8 hours per day, we have to make sure that it's not uninterrupted.
Right. And what are the key differences between exercises like dance and aerobic walking, since they're both forms of physical exercise? This is from Neha. She's curious if you've quantified the cognitive and physical demands on both tasks on the participants.
Yeah, so during the intervention, our participants were monitored for their heart rate. And they also were, I think, not all the time, but occasionally the accelerometers. So in our particular setup, right, because dance can be very different. In our particular setup, definitely the heart rate was more elevated in our aerobic walking group, because they had kind of really this period of 40 to 50 minutes of walking, and the dance had more breaks and they had varied intensity. And we know that the walking group gained more in their aerobic fitness. On the other hand, we know that the dance part had more cognitive and social components. But another thing that's a separate thing in evaluating those clinical trials, that another study, it's actually published, investigated contamination from the trial. When some people who actually were walking as a part of this laboratory intervention, they ceased other activity they were doing outside of that intervention. But people who were dancing, although the dance intervention was not so intense, they actually, some of them reported taking up other activities outside of the intervention. So, I mean, it just shows that doing like super clean laboratory research with humans is difficult, because different aspects of the intervention can sometimes prompt people, like they can even discourage and motivate them for out of the lab activities that are really hard to measure constantly. It's like a huge amount of data if we would measure them constantly, right?
Could you speak on the significance of the social and emotional engagement experienced in the dancing? Dancing alone versus with others to brain health?
I wish I could, but this is a bit out of the scope of my research. So when it comes to measuring social interactions and emotional effects, I actually really focus on the cognitive and brain measures. So I could only speculate, but I do not have any data on this.
Which is
a related question. Sorry, Alan.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Mark.
Really fascinating, Dr. Burzynska. I was just wondering to follow up on the cognitive versus or physical benefits of dancing versus speed walking. And I'm wondering if that stimulation that you get from listening to music and trying to match movement with those musical patterns increases the cognition or the cognitive stimulation. And I wonder, and you may not know this, but whether or not if you incorporate music in other types of aerobic activity like speed walking or biking or conversation during those activities, would that be a similar cognitive stimulation to dancing?
I mean, I honestly don't know because we didn't test this, so I don't know. And I do not study music too much. I'm not very talented myself in that domain. But I think I think there are a lot of studies, you know, happening, trying to find this like optimal thing. But to be honest, we tried the dance intervention because we knew that it would be very hard to make people engage in this just walking long time. Because all of us, I guess, get disengaged. I know so many people who just don't find running fun enough. I find it fun, but I know many people don't. So the dancing was partly as a more like age appropriate, more kind of motivating form of exercise. So I think honestly that a lot of people, you know, some people may choose walking with music or walking with audiobooks. So I think in the end, when it comes to really physical exercise, everyone has to find what they enjoy and what they can, you know, build into their everyday routine. And I remember years ago, I talked to much more senior scientist, and we talked about physical activity. And I think this may be important for especially students, is when I said, so does it really matter how much you exercise when you're young? And he said, we don't know yet, but it's important to find type of activity you can or you enjoy doing, because most likely you will carry that interest and that routine until very old age. So, you know, it's better to find your passion, and it can be, I don't know, capoeira, it can be running, it can be aerobics, like many different things I believe that are beneficial. That you find joy in doing it for like 6 decades.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Aga, I just wanted to relate something with that. I was curious that in the dancing intervention, were they learning how to dance or they were dancing to their pleasure? So the reason I ask this question is when you bring in the component of learning, then obviously it is cognitively more demanding and perhaps more useful.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so maybe to start first, we did not really find any group level increases in cognitive performance in our sample. But we also know that the test effect, so if we test people with similar tasks 6 months apart, it's a pretty strong effect. So in cognitively healthy people, it's often hard to really find an increase if they're already pretty high functioning. So at the cognitive level, we did not really see improvement, but we saw improvement in the physiological and brain measures. And I definitely think that the dancing group got stimulated in a different way than the walking group. because yes, they did learn choreographies, and it was specially designed for not being assigned to any specific partner. So there was a mixture of line dance and contra dance. And yes, the choreographies were becoming, they were progressing to more complex choreographies. They were changing partners. And some recordings I have seen from those classes, like sometimes it was pretty vigorous, but then they would have this 10 minutes of vigorous activity followed by rest and instruction. So yeah, I think that those interventions definitely differ. And maybe that's why, depending on the brain measure, we also find slightly different effects between dance and walking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What about resistance training? Is aerobic exercise superior to resistance training with respect to cognitive benefits?
It's a great question. I must say, I don't feel like I'm an expert of each type of training on all the physiological levels, but from what I know, resistance training can also increase the aerobic capacity of the brain, right? So there were some studies, I think, showing also effects of resistance training. I haven't done a study like this myself, but I believe that it may work too. We just know that, especially, increasing the blood flow is very good for improving vascular health. And as other researchers at CSU work on arterial elasticity and stiffness, we have also done studies on that, and we know that the stiffness of the vessels in the brain, it's also related to brain health quite strongly. So aerobic exercise that helps us preserve the arterial elasticity, it's also resulting in less of this mechanic damage of the brain tissue. I think that there's just less research a bit on resistance training. And I think that, honestly, I don't know, maybe some of my colleagues from HES would disagree, but from what I've been hearing all the time is that moderation and variety is kind of good at every level. So I don't think, I think even any athlete who does even like strength exercises, they still have to do aerobic training to be good. So I would say perhaps the mixture of all, so that we can also enjoy and avoid physical injuries. I think, I personally think that this doesn't have to be finding one type of activity that it's only good, because it depends how we do it, depends if we enjoy it. And I think, I don't know, from what I know about any kind of sports training, is that, the mixture, we have to strengthen all elements. So I would say, yeah, aerobic training with elements of resistance will perfect.
Right. Switching gears a little bit out of exercise, why do you say your results on the effects of activity on brain aging are only preliminary? That is, what do you need to do next to make your results more robust?
Thanks. Well, that's how it goes in research. Before we can really make recommendations, every interesting result has to be replicated by someone else in an independent study. So even if our study was rigorous and it was a registered clinical trial, to make sure that we can talk about those effects, that they just have to be replicated. Ideally in a slightly different sample, I mean, not in the same adults, and maybe using slightly different outcomes, or maybe, different duration. And there are such studies underway. There are also studies now, there's a new big trial in Pittsburgh that also assesses, different kind of volumes of exercise. So some group doesn't really exercise, one meets the recommendation, and one really exceeds the recommendations for physical activity, because we don't know if there is a dose response effect. We don't know if there's any minimum amount of exercise here that will help. That's gonna be enough. So that's what I'm saying. Like there's still of those small pieces we should know before we can tell people like that's exactly what you're gonna have to do.
Can you tell us a little more about the nutritional supplement from your study? Some nutritional supplements like antioxidants are thought to limit some of the physical adaptations to exercise. Could antioxidants also limit the cognitive benefits of exercise?
I do not know, and our nutritional supplement was not an antioxidant. It was actually, if I remember correctly, beta-alanine. So it was supposed to promote the lean muscle mass growth and kind of boosting the effect of aerobic training, especially on the muscles, because we thought if there is such supplements and there would be just bigger gain in aerobic fitness because of this like more the muscle constitute this like demand factor of aerobic cardiovascular fitness. So that they have this higher metabolic rate that we could boost this effect on the brain and cognitive level. But honestly, we did not observe that. So we did not see any increased effects for those people who took this nutritional supplement.
And have you measured other variables that affect brain health aside from physical activity, like diet, sleep, socioeconomics, and their effects on brain aging?
Yeah, you see, I see those because we collect this data often to kind of covary for it in statistic analysis. But I try to do one thing well, and that's why I do not try to look too much into nutrition or sleep, although I did do some preliminary analysis and we did find something. We just did not publish this yet because we had very small sample size, so it's not such a strong effect. But I did observe some correlation with more ingestion of trans fats and lower white matter integrity. But again, this is a small study and I was not too confident in it, so we didn't publish it, or not yet.
Right. We might have time for one more question if anyone has something quick they'd like to ask. If not, I just want to let everyone know that have been recording this. So if you're interested in it, I'm about to drop my email down in the chat, and I can make sure that you get a copy of that video once it's all finished.
Thank you, everyone.